the next session, I hope, will be very interesting. We've assembled a very high caliber panel. So I'm going to ask the panelists to join me, join David and I up on stage here. So Jack and Andreas and Jan and David, please come up here. We've assembled them to discuss the question, ICES, evidence and impact, looking back and looking forward. I guess it's not a question, but we're going to ask them to do that, to look back and look forward. And as they assemble it, it was quite notable in that video just how much of the issues that were discussed were the same ones we face today. But the thing that I thought was interesting was how much of that video was focusing on hospitals. Every image we saw was about a hospital, and yet today we're looking so much beyond hospitals. This is one interesting way things have perhaps changed, although many of the other challenges are much the same as David mentioned. So we've assembled this high caliber panel, and the operating principle that I'm going to work under is that I'm going to try not to get in between the speakers and the microphone. I know that could be a dangerous place. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of them to give a few remarks, probably a maximum of about 4 minutes each, talking about ICES, evidence and impact, looking back and looking forward. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please come to the microphone. I have a few questions if need be. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to David. We're going to ask them to speak in chronological order of their time as CEO. So David will go first.
I've always had a problem with authority, so I'm not going first. You've already heard enough from me. There's much more interesting people, so let's pass it on. Thank you, Michael.
And under 4 minutes.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here. And in my best Woody Allen fashion, this is a nostalgia trip. And I love it. But I'm going to stretch back a bit more and sort of address the question, well, how come ICES ended up at Sunnybrook? And there is a very nice booklet that Sunnybrook put out on its history. And essentially, under the leadership of Peter Ellis and Murray Martin in the mid-1980s, they really did move toward trying to establish research programs within a teaching hospital. And they also added units, trauma, cancer, cardiovascular surgery, extending chronic care and chronic care nursing to veterans, building research facilities, including the research building, and then the Boyd Academy in terms of becoming an integral part of the undergraduate program in medicine at Toronto. But they did have a bit of a vision in that Peter and Martin were looking at the health maintenance organizations which were starting up in the United States under the direction of Paul Elwood. Actually, it was a redirection of health maintenance organizations. Donald Berwick was one of the people who were involved. And it really was trying to get a sense of getting a handle on clinical effectiveness of services provided by hospitals. And that's why the Sunnybrook agreed to put money into a clinical epidemiology program. And that's why they were looking for somebody to kind of get things started. And so I rolled onto the scene in 1989, working in that direction. Primary health care, the family practice program had a research unit. Department of Medicine was heavily involved, releasing time from faculty for involvement in research. Orthopedic surgery, Sandra Black was there being heavily engaged in research. And one can just run down the list. There were a number of people who wanted to get involved in what we now call clinical epidemiology. I think what was more likely to be called clinical evaluation or clinical effectiveness at the time. And things had moved along well enough that John Paul Zalai and Marco Katic had set up a biostatistical research group, and they were working extensively with clinical investigators. And then a major turning point was when Mark Hinkleman came on as Vice President of Research. And I had the honor of serving on the search committee for the full-time Director of Clinical Epidemiology. And lo and behold, David came, and we really got the research program started with the influx of very good people in addition to those presently on board at the time. Why did David want to come and work with me? I don't know. But it worked. And I think somebody asked me if I would have bet a cup of coffee that ICES would last 20 years, or make a bet. And I said maybe a cup of coffee. But it really did work out. There was one kind of glitch on the political scene that David did not mention. ICES was funded, I think, at $5 million a year to start. And at the time that the announcement was made that an institute would be funded without any kind of peer review or commission to examine its origins, personnel, etc., the ministry withdrew extramural funding for research in health. And that helped set the tone for ICES and its working relationships with clinical epidemiologists across the province.
Oh, boy.
But, and then I will say another thing that I did not anticipate was just how important the clinical epidemiology program, first in terms of clinical researchers who were interested and involved, and then secondly, the impact of the investigators that were coming through the graduate program in clinical epidemiology and coming to ICES and with an expressed interest in working with data and forming collaborative research groups. There was no way I could have anticipated how ICES was going to benefit from that. So, Sunnybrook provided a great platform. We got the right leadership in place, and we got the growing interest and enthusiasm for clinical evaluative sciences, and here we are today, 20 years later.
First off, one thing Jack hasn't told you is how important he was, along with so many others. Marcia Cohen, Don DeBoer, a raft of people, Klaus, and getting the data together and the data linkage done. But there is another heroine who should be acknowledged, and that is Ontario's current Privacy and Freedom of Information Commissioner, Anne Kabukian. And she and Jack, she was a deputy commissioner then, had a fantastic working relationship. And Anne understood that this information was vitally important to the future of healthcare and health for Ontario, that the information could have a worldwide impact, but that, the potential consequences of a privacy breach were disastrous, right? Your Uncle Harry's vasectomy, your Aunt Mary's colonoscopy, you name it, it could all be out there. And so with great skill and sensitivity, Anne worked with Jack, and Jack in turn, with his usual skill and wisdom, worked with her and so many others to begin to create a framework that I think in many ways guides us still. Obviously, Pam Slaughter and others have done important work on ethics around the health services research. Many on faculty have done so. But that founding framework, I think, is due very much to Jack and Anne. So one of the key things, one of the key building blocks, in addition to Sunnybrook as a host and all the talent and wonderful people, was not only to access the data, but to begin to marshal them carefully with due regard to those trade-offs. So I just wanted to add that footnote since we're busy reminiscing, and it's such fun to think back, I have to say, and to see all these people who didn't get older.
One initial personal reminiscence and then a couple other thoughts that came from David's talk. When I became the CEO of ICES, it was an incredibly kind of intimidating position to be in, partly because of the quality of the folks that had preceded me, but also because, frankly, I'd never done a piece of administrative database research in my life. And I'd also never been anything but an academic. So first of all, I hadn't had any experience with actually the core business of ICES. And secondly, actually, I had no experience I'd actually sat on what used to be the Drug Quality and Therapeutics Committee, but that was probably my closest experience with sort of the intersection between academia and sort of policy and medical politics. And also, actually, I had worked or studied at Queen's, UWO, McMaster, and Ottawa, but I'd never, ever been in Toronto. I actually didn't understand the complexity, actually, of the massive medical complex in the GTA, actually, which, if you think about it, almost half of Ontario's population lives here. And this is a really embarrassing sort of anecdote to tell, but fairly early on, this is before LINS, I was at one of the district, I think they were called District Health Council offices up on Yonge Street, and there were a bunch of high-powered folks in the room, and we were talking about something I've forgotten about what it was now, and people kept on talking about GTA, and I kept on thinking, what the hell's a GTA? And finally, actually, I asked that question, and they looked at me like I was a friggin' moron, right? So that gives you a sense of kind of how green I was, and how much I owe all of the folks at ICES, staff, faculty, everybody. And actually, frankly, people at the ministry, people like Phil Jackson, Les Levine, who was probably one of the first people in the ministry to ever walk through the door when I was CEO. So I just owe everybody, actually, a huge debt of thanks. Two thoughts that came out of David's presentation. I used to think that one of my most important jobs as CEO was actually, the ideal thing would be the ministry or people, stakeholders in the community would come up with a policy-relevant question that would ask ICES to answer that, and that policy-relevant question was actually of interest to the academics at ICES, and they would answer that question and both help further their career within academia, which actually was important because a lot of salaries of ICES scientists came from the university and from CIHR grants, so you had to be academically productive. So the project would be both policy relevant and academically productive. And I guess one of the things when I think back on my 6 years as CEO, I'm still struck by how well that worked. And there is this kind of myth that, like, if you do policy relevant stuff, it's somehow not that academic and vice versa. And I think ICES actually has done a fantastic job, not just only ICES, but other health services organizations, to show that that isn't the case and the two can coexist quite nicely. If I look at the future, one of the things I also struggled with as CEO was sort of our provincial mandate and the need for regions in the province. They all have, like, the healthcare needs in Northwestern Ontario is very different from the healthcare needs here, right? But we had this kind of provincial mandate. And when I was the CEO, the LINS didn't exist. And I frankly think I didn't do a great job I think we did a pretty good job of the provincial mandate. I don't think we did as good a job as addressing kind of local or regional needs as we could. And as I look forward to the future, I think that's a real kind of challenge and an opportunity for ICES. I think because our block funder is the ministry, I frankly probably thought that the block funding is a ministry, and the ministry is phenomenally important, but a lot of the receptors of our research are actually regional. I think it's important that we remember that. So let me just end by sort of a brief talk about sort of what I'm most proud of, not from me, but ICES during the time I was there. And one is actually the phenomenal scientists that we have. And when I first arrived, very junior scientists like Mohammed Mamdani, actually, Mike, you were pretty early in your career, David Alter, Doug Manuel, Peter Austin. Those kind of folks, I think, were all within 1 to 3 years of starting their career, and with the nurturing support of this community, they've done phenomenally well. And then there's other folks who are doing their PhDs and postdocs, like Doug Lee, Walter Wojcik, Susan Bronskill, Chaim Bell, Dave Yerlink, and I apologize to all those that I've forgotten, but I think it just shows, sometimes I worry that when an organization grows its own and keeps its own all the time, but if you look at the quality of those people and why they stayed, I think that's a real sort of credit to the organization. And the other thing that I'm really proud of is that we started the road to ICES centers outside of Toronto. And I'm very grateful to Jan and David for continuing that. I think that's just a really, really important thing. And then the final thing, as I was preparing these remarks this morning, that I didn't think about at all, but was reminded when I saw the pictures, was that I forgot that we built that new wing at ICES. And, A, that's bloody embarrassing, but B, I think it maybe shows actually how smoothly that went, actually. So the incredible hard work of, I won't name all the people, but an incredible number of people to make that new wing possible. Those are the three things that I reflect about most positively during my 6-year tenure. Thanks.
It's also a pleasure for me to be here, and I feel a bit of an imposter, having been only an interim CEO. Perhaps I'm the token female on the panel, but in any case, I'm delighted to be here to celebrate an organization that's been an important part of my life for 20 years. One of the things that Mike asked the panelists to potentially reflect on was things that they only discovered after having been in the chair that might have helped them had they known it before. And I think for me, that thing would be how resilient ICES is. My term came at a turbulent time for ICES. You had an interim CEO with no or very little leadership experience. We were without a vice president of corporate services. This was the first post-wait time strategy budget. We had gotten a great amount of additional funding to support the wait time strategy, had brought on staff, and now those staff were stranded with apparently no budget to support them, and we were projecting a deficit. And despite all those challenges, we were moving forward on Andreas's vision of the expansion, a prospect that some felt threatening. If we give our data away to others, will we still have our competitive advantage? And as well, put a real strain on the resources of the Institute during a transition time. And yet ICES survived and thrived. I'm reminded of a small child who seemingly hasn't eaten a single piece of fruit or vegetable for 3 months, and you're looking up the symptoms of scurvy and rickets. But kids are resilient, and ICES has been remarkably resilient, and I think will continue to make it through the storms and past the shoals that are before us as we navigate forward. And as the Institute, I still use we referring to ICES, despite the fact I've been gone for 6 months. I also bring the perspective of, although a short tenure in the CEO chair, a very long time at ICES, almost 20 years in the organization. And I'm really proud to say that I think the evidence we produce speaks for itself. It's developed through rigorous processes, it's credible, and it's insightfully interpreted. But there's another level at which our research doesn't speak for itself, and we need to give it a voice. And I think that that's one of the ways that ICES has really changed and grown over the 20 years I've been there. I think back to an early study that David Naylor will remember, where we looked at the impact of the ODB copay on access to medications. That, instead of working collaboratively with the ministry, I would say that my stance with them was probably aggressive and antagonistic. I seem to think that in order to be independent, I had to be obtuse, and I can remember several near shouting matches with people at ODB, and I believe Mary Catherine Lindbergh was on the phone for some of them, over even getting the data to do the study and then over the releasing of the results. And the study, as far as we can tell, had no impact. 20 years later, things have changed dramatically. And I won't say that everybody was as obtuse as I was back then. Some of the early work that Jack Tu and David did on risk-adjusted cardiac surgery outcomes had an immediate impact and has had a lasting impact. And I think that the foundation, the credibility of the work that was done at the time has been an important part of the platform for the new position that we're in. But it is a new position where we are really, where ICES is the go-to institution for those important policy-relevant questions, and where the generous and capable staff and faculty at ICES continue to make themselves available to address policy questions. And I can't take credit for that except for being the bad example at the beginning of the stretch, but I'm very proud of what ICES has done in that regard. Thank you.
This is tough. As an Australian who really felt like I was parachuted in late 2007 into this organization with its history, its luminaries who had been in the CEO's seat in the previous 15 years. It really was quite overwhelming, and overwhelming for a number of reasons, but I should start with something that I think you can relate to. And that's the Australian view of my first winter in Canada. And I know it's a cheap shot, and I'm going to lower the tone, but I'll come back. There were many stories from that first winter that Gillian, my wife, and I had, because if you recall, it was quite a bad winter. But I won't go through them. But one sticks, and I apologize for this one, but I'm going to tell it. And that was quite late one night. It was 7 or 8 o'clock. I went to avail myself of the facility, the men's room, on level 2 of the building, and stood there as one does, waiting. And then you're
Too much information.
Too much information. I've got to go on though. I do. But what struck me was the noise wasn't the same. It wasn't the same noise. Yeah. And the toilet bowl had completely frozen solid. It was thick ice. Something I'd never experienced, something that's completely alien. And I didn't know, and I leant forward and tried to flush it, stupidly, it's just a reflux. Absolutely no chance. It was completely solid. And that just reminded me I was in a different environment from what I was used to. But the intellectual environment is the truly stimulating thing. And the legacy of people like David, Jack, Andreas, and Jan is very clear. I was struck in the video looking at it, as Michael Schul said, first of all these people running around in white coats. Secondly, that so much of the work was concerned with hospital-based. And inevitably that was the case because it was the data of the time. Variability, wait times, length of stay. All important things, but that was what was measured. It would be some of the classic health services work that followed on the pioneering work of Norlu and Leslie Roos that David Naylor has mentioned. What I thought would do to contrast it was just to describe some of the studies that have come across my desk in the last few months. I mean, I'm talking probably about the last 10 months, and just contrast that with the work, the important work that was in that video. In no particular, actually the order is based on memory, it's the most recent first. So this week is over in the corner, Don Rielmar and his colleagues showed that reporting medically unfit drivers in Ontario was associated with a substantial fall in motor vehicle accidents with a consequential reduction in injuries and death. I mean, a really important finding and something that needs to be emphasized. On the other hand, it showed, in typical Don, looking at two sides, was that it probably had an adverse effect on the doctor-patient relationship. So, not unexpectedly. But that contrast, but the importance of that work is fairly clear. At the same time, I think almost on the same day, Gillian Booth and her colleagues were publishing a paper that showed that the walkability of neighborhoods, measured by a number of indices, appears to have an influence on the risk of developing diabetes in areas in Toronto. quite a striking finding, and they're quite big effects in certain groups in the population. The same group, just a few weeks before, we'll think about the implications of that for urban design and walkability, the number of cross streets, how far it is you have to walk to the nearest important, useful retail outlet. Is it less than 10 minutes, or is it 15 or 20 minutes? Or is it one of these endless walks in the suburbs that doesn't actually take you anywhere? The walkability really matters. The same group showed just 2 or 3 weeks earlier that if you looked at the outcomes of people with diabetes, there was a striking socioeconomic gradient in the under 65s, with the poor people doing worse, dying more frequently and developing heart attacks and strokes more frequently, whereas the over 65s, it wasn't happening. But unusual. How would socioeconomic status differentially affect different age groups? The most likely thing is the lack of universal drug coverage in the under 65s. I cannot understand why a country as sophisticated and as wealthy as Canada does not have universal drug coverage. I won't go on, but it remains a complete mystery to me that that's the case. A short time ago, Doug Lee and his colleagues showed that a simple algorithm derived from routinely collected data, augmented by some clinical information, predicts, applied in the emergency department, predicts the risk of dying from heart failure and indicates who needs to come in, but equally important, who can we reasonably safely discharge? Talking about emergency departments, Astrid Gupp and Michael Schul and others showed last year in a paper measuring multiple millions of interactions in emergency departments, the wait time for people that are discharged, the wait time is really important. And those people who wait longer are going to do worse, and that translates into more deaths. On heart failure, the risk of the rates of admissions from heart failure have fallen by 1/3 in 10 years. 1/3. That's a huge decline. A very carefully done, simple study, but pointed to something terribly important. Therese Stuckel, I'll name but one, but there are always co-authors and co-investigators, has shown that unlike the US, higher spending hospitals, higher spending intensity hospitals tend to do better for certain important diseases than lower spending intensity. We've found that opiates, particularly long-acting orally available opiates, can be quite dangerous, and there are some doctors who are prescribing them in high doses, and guess what? They kill more people when they prescribe them in high doses. If you come into hospital for elective surgery and you get an opiate, within a week, around about the time of that elective surgery, you're significantly more likely to still be on opiates a year later. You're kind of addicted to them, and that can be initiated through some innocent, well-intended actions by people around the time of elective surgery. We learned about the life course of COPD from Andrew Gershon, a really important study documenting the not-so-pretty outcomes and the high frequency of this rather neglected condition. On the health services side, Therese Stuckel and colleagues have shown that it looks like Ontario is home to 75 multidisciplinary physician networks that might be the focus of some much needed reorganization of delivery of care that might form the basis of accountable care organizations. So the breadth and depth of work that started was obviously limited by the data that are available now with the richer, more diverse data sources, are multiple sites now. We put in about 40 CIHR grants in the last competition. Many of them have come from our expansion sites. U of T, Queen's, Ottawa, now Western, going to open by the end of the year, and we hope McMaster next year. This is a phenomenal increase in productivity. The increasing engagement at the ministry, in many areas of the ministry, is critical. The idea now that evidence won't go into action, or that people won't act on evidence, I'm actually worried a little bit now that they're sometimes too ready to jump and act on evidence. I'm not being critical, but I think it reflects the impact of the work that's been done. The impact is great. So this has been an extraordinarily successful enterprise. What does the future hold? We're doing more in the field of population health, social and economic determinants of health, but really, really important. We'll be looking at social services, social policies. We're going to be linking educational data to health data. We're working for the first, not for the first time, but in the first time in a considered and systematic way with biomedical researchers, and we'll be linking bioinformatics data to health services data for the first time. And finally, I'll mention the growth of distributed networks around the world. I'm glad that Pat Martins is going to talk later on, is here from the Manitoba Centre. In some ways, to me, the Manitoba Centre and ICES have evolved like cousins, I think. Pat, I'm sure, has some words for it that she'll give us later on. But oftentimes we've followed, I think, their lead. We have some advantages in terms of the size of the province and the data sets that we have, but not in terms of the quality of the work. But now, centres like ICES and Manitoba are linked. We're working as a distributed network. The data stay at the centres. They don't cross jurisdictional boundaries. They're analysed in situ, and then the analyses are combined using meta-analytic techniques. This has started. Pat and I regularly attend, Mac Patterson, regularly attend meetings of the Canadian Network for Observational Drug Effect Studies, which is an insured population, which is greater than the population of Canada by virtue of bringing in some overseas data sets. We now study drug effects in over 40 million people. And we are getting some very interesting results from this work. This is the future. It will not be limited to drug effect studies. I'm sure these distributed networks around the world are going to be studying many, many different aspects of care and outcomes of care. So you can't help but be both astonished by the productivity of the work, the value of these data sets, the sheer energy, drive, and innovation of the scientists, the staff, all of the staff. We have boards. We have two board chairs, one current, one ex-board chair in the audience, and the boards, our boards have really allowed us to flourish. It's critical to have a board. We're a non-profit corporation. We must have a board that enables us to flourish and expand. And that's clearly embodied, those views, by the boards and the chairs, the fact that they're here today, and their views of ICES as an innovative, growing organization. So I am very, very optimistic about the future. I think it's going to be different from the past, but I think it's going to be rich, very interesting. And above all, I think it's still fun. I really do. I'm envious. I'm quite jealous, actually, that I wasn't there in the early days, because I think to sit around that table and to be able to have that buzz, that sense of collective interest in a topic, that you're breaking new ground, must have been very exciting. And to be honest, we don't get the opportunity now with 160 scientists, 5 sites, 6 programs. It really doesn't happen. And I'm sorry I didn't get that. But what we're doing now is the natural evolution of what was started. The foundational principles are still intact, and the work of the previous CEOs has ensured this. So I want to express my deep gratitude to all of them for that, and the privilege of being able to follow them. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Michael has given me a chance to just add some further reflections. You know, if you're a bureaucrat stuck in the machinery of the university like me, this is a brain spa. Not only is it a trip down memory lane, but you could feel dead neurons coming back to life. It's fantastic. One of the things that I remember in the video brought back, and that I hated when I saw it all those years ago, was that one slip-up where I said you would use outcomes data to pick the best treatment, which is a kind of basic inferential no-no, right? Observational data. And what is interesting is that the new lines of investigation, which build on that whole kind of transdisciplinary thought process from the outset, and are so rich and exciting. Wow. In many ways, they are stepping around that more narrow clinical focus on treatment and figuring out different ways to use the data, where that inevitable challenge of confounding in decision-making would not be a rate-limiting step to application. Doesn't mean there's not cautions, as David has said, about taking those conclusions to policy or management practice. But it is exciting to hear that many of these, whether it's an algorithm for making decisions, as distinct from an overt intervention and treatment, are being applied, and where the balance of risks and benefits from use of that kind of observational data is more likely to be tilted in favor of benefit. So it's an extraordinary flowering of creativity in dealing with what I would say is still the evergreen limitation, and that is use of observational data to draw conclusive inferences. And that does lead me to a question about the extent to which ICES is active today in what I might call intervention studies, or the explicit revectoring of natural experiments in healthcare to provide more in the way of an unconfounded view of things that are happening or that ought to happen. And I just wondered if some of the CEOs on the panel had thoughts about that kind of use of the data as a measurement tool in the construct of more purposive rather than natural experiments to deal with some of the inevitable confounding and constraints of what is nonetheless a remarkable resource.
So we'll take that as the first question to kick off the Q&A part of this session from David. So any of you?
Yeah, I think I had a little section down here on my biggest disappointments, which as I was going through it, I thought would be kind of a downer in my initial comment, so I skipped it. One of the two was precisely that, David, that I don't think, at least during my tenure, I can think of a single kind of step-wedged RCT or that we kind of in a, if you will, experimental way assess new policy interventions either in different hospitals or regions. I think Jack 2 did a study using CIHR dollars, but it almost never happened. And we recruited Merrick Zornstein, so a world expert in pragmatic trials, and I think most of Merrick's pragmatic trials still come from South Africa and are done, and I'm almost struck by the fact that the developing world actually is much more courageous and innovative actually in doing sort of high quality RCTs of policy interventions than we are, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think, Mike, you might be involved in a couple of pragmatic trials in the emergency department, so I haven't been in the CEO seat for 6 years,
But they're not ICES projects.
Okay, so I think you've hit on a really important thing, David, and something actually that I think in the future, obviously you can't do it without ministry partners because that's kind of a scary thing politically sometimes to do, but I think it's an important issue.
Just before, David, you answer that question, I will invite anyone in the audience who has a question, please come up to I guess there's only one mic here, but come on up, we'll have some more questions for David.
Doing intervention studies of policy change requires not only that we have scientists and that we have data, but we need those receptors within the ministry that are prepared to go with some form of allocation which is different from the selection process that they are very, very strongly wedded to. And I can think of a couple of examples. I'll name one that has been quite striking for me while we've been here, and that's the issue of providing tele-home care for people with certain chronic disease, particularly congestive heart failure and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, where you put a module into patients' houses that they sit and put on the pulse oximeter and hold the electrodes and put on a blood pressure cuff each morning. And those data are uploaded, there's a range check, and then somebody looks at the out-of-range data and decides whether some intervention's needed. We've been flirting with the idea of an evaluation for some time, for ages in fact, and thought we got close to a step wedge on 2 occasions, and then each time have drawn back. And I wouldn't say it was necessarily just people within the ministry. The LINs were reluctant as well. The point I'm making is it's complicated to do these studies, but they are possible. And I think, Michael Schull, I think you've got some experience. I was thinking of EDGIM, whether you'd consider that was one where there was a hope for randomization and intervention. But
well, there was a hope in that the ministry funded us to do essentially a sort of cluster randomized trial, but then changed their mind midway through, and it was completely observational at the end. David?
This issue of the relationship with the ministry that Jan and David have both touched on, and Andreas, is an interesting one. We had, by and large, a positive working relationship, and our experience certainly mirrored Andreas's experience. The questions that came from stakeholders in particular were fantastic, and many ended up being not only springboards to great research, including peer-reviewed research, but also were sort of the skeleton keys that opened very large methodological doors that then became whole, areas of activity for people to do more fundamental investigation. That said, David's caveat about the receptor capacity in the ministry is interesting. The reason I fuss about government-led transformation is because the system is so complex. Yeah. And the levers available to what I think are generally remarkably dedicated people in the ministry are pretty crude. Nothing's changed in that regard. Still pretty crude, big levers. And so anything that can be done that moves to a situation where the ministry can pull more subtle levers and align incentives is appealing. And I just wanted to come on that point to this issue of Therese's work on multidisciplinary referral networks and say that's one where I hope the ministry does move to establish these. I know there's enthusiasm, and I certainly am enthusiastic about it. And if we had accountable care organizations, a Made in Canada version of them, what a fantastic opportunity to randomize those networks, right? Take the ones that are the current operational multidisciplinary referral networks and decide to fund X number on an integrated funding model with block funding and Y number randomly not, and see what happens to accessibility and quality as well as value. Those are the areas where moving to an intervention-based, more rigorous platform for assessing system receptor reforms would be so fantastic. So, David, Godspeed. I hope you can make that happen.
Question.